"Dad, I'm so sorry," Cordelia had said just an hour earlier, her voice as cold as winter steel. "I completely forgot to book your ticket to Hawaii. But don't worry, I got you this nice room in the city instead. You can rest." Her stepmother Vivian stood behind her, barely containing a smirk. My son-in-law Holden wouldn't even look at me. Even my two grandchildren, Paisley and Knox, seemed to avoid my eyes as they wheeled their designer luggage past me toward the gate. The truth hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned, calculated. They'd taken my money I'd given them willingly, joyfully, because I thought we were finally going to be a family again after Cordelia's mother died 3 years ago. I thought this trip would heal the wounds between us, bring us closer together. Instead, they'd orchestrated the most humiliating betrayal I could imagine. Before we dive in, let's connect. If a betrayal like this shocks you as much as it did me, stay with me. You'll want to hear the rest of my journey. Drop a broken heart in the comments if this kind of family betrayal hits close to home. And stay tuned, because the revenge in this story is more powerful than you'd ever expect. As I watched their plane disappear into the clouds, taking my money and my dreams with it, something inside me broke. But something else awakened. For 58 years, I'd been Theodore Teddy Brennan, the nice guy, the pushover, the man who always put everyone else first. I'd raised Cordelia alone after her mother passed, worked myself to the bone to give her everything she wanted, even paid for her wedding to that pretentious investment banker who treated me like hired help. But standing there in that airport, clutching a worthless boarding pass to nowhere, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not just anger, though that burned white-hot in my chest. Not just betrayal, though that cut deeper than any physical wound. It was clarity. Crystal clear, ice-cold clarity about who my daughter really was and what I was going to do about it. 3 months earlier, everything had seemed so different. I remember the exact moment Cordelia called me about the Hawaii trip. I was fixing Mrs. Patterson's fence next door, something I did for free because that's the kind of man I'd always been. "Dad," she'd said, her voice bright with excitement, "I have the most amazing idea. What if we all went to Hawaii together? You, me, Holden, the kids, even Vivian. A real family vacation." My heart had soared. Since her mother Elena died of cancer, Cordelia and I had grown distant. She'd married Holden 6 months after the funeral, and suddenly, I wasn't welcome at family dinners anymore. My grandchildren barely knew me. When she suggested this trip, I thought maybe grief had finally loosened its grip on both of us. Maybe we could rebuild what we'd lost. "It'll be expensive," I'd warned her, though my mind was already racing with possibilities. "The resort you're talking about, that's luxury level." She'd laughed, that musical sound I remembered from when she was little and we'd build sandcastles at Lake Huron every summer. "Dad, don't worry about money. We're family. We'll figure it out together." Those words had melted every wall I'd built around my heart. I should have seen the signs. When I offered to pay for everything, the flights, the resort, the activities, Cordelia had accepted too quickly. No protests, no insistence that they could handle their share. Just a bright smile, and "That's so generous, Dad. You're the best." Holden had been strangely absent from all our planning conversations. And Vivian, Cordelia's new stepmother figure who'd moved in with us after Elena's death, had watched our interactions with calculating eyes. But I was so hungry for connection, so desperate to feel like I belonged somewhere again, that I ignored every red flag. I liquidated my pension early, took a second mortgage on the house Elena and I had bought 30 years ago, even sold her jewelry, something that had torn my heart out, but seemed worth it for the chance to be a grandfather again, to be part of my daughter's life. As I hung up the phone that day, I'd felt happier than I had since Elena's funeral. I had no idea I'd just agreed to fund my own destruction. The weeks leading up to the trip had been a whirlwind of planning and anticipation. Cordelia visited more in those 2 months than she had in the previous 2 years. She'd bring little Paisley and Knox over, and for brief, shining moments, it felt like we were a real family again. The kids would climb on my lap, while I showed them pictures of Hawaii on my old computer, their eyes wide with wonder at the beaches and volcanoes. Grandpa Teddy, 6-year-old Paisley, had whispered to me one afternoon, "Mommy says you're taking us somewhere magical." Knox, who was 8 and usually too cool for grandfather affection, had actually hugged me that day. "Thanks, Grandpa. This is going to be the best vacation ever." Those moments had made every sacrifice feel worthwhile. I'd have sold my soul to see that joy in their eyes. Cordelia had handled all the bookings, insisting it would be easier since she understood all the modern travel websites. I'd transferred the money in chunks, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, until my accounts were nearly empty. Each time, she'd call to confirm the deposits with such professional efficiency that it never occurred to me to ask for confirmation numbers or receipts. Trust. That's what families were supposed to have. The night before our departure, Vivian had cooked a family dinner, something that had become rare since she'd moved into our house. She'd made Elena's recipe for pot roast, which had both touched and unsettled me. As we sat around the dinner table, Holden had actually engaged me in conversation about work, asking about my plans for retirement with what seemed like genuine interest. Cordelia had been radiant, laughing at my old stories about her childhood, reminiscing about family trips we'd taken when Elena was alive. Looking back now, their performance had been flawless. Every smile, every laugh, every moment of connection had been carefully orchestrated to keep me compliant and unsuspecting. As I'd gone to bed that night, I'd felt something I hadn't experienced since Elena's diagnosis. Pure, uncomplicated happiness. Tomorrow, I will board a plane with my family and create new memories in paradise. Tomorrow, I will finally stop being a lonely old man and become a beloved patriarch again. I fell asleep that night with tears of joy on my cheeks, completely oblivious to the fact that I'd just lived through my last happy day. The morning started with a small, subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite name. I'd been packed for days, my worn but clean clothes folded with military precision in the suitcase Elena had bought me for our honeymoon 35 years ago. When I knocked on Cordelia's bedroom door at 5 a.m., our flight was at 10, and I'd always believed in arriving early. There was no answer. The house felt eerily quiet. I found them all in the kitchen, already dressed and ready, their expensive luggage lined up by the door like a luxury showroom display. But something was off. They were whispering among themselves, and when I entered, the conversation stopped abruptly. "Morning, Dad," Cordelia said, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Ready for paradise?" There was something in her tone that made my stomach clench with unidentifiable dread. The drive to the airport had been unusually quiet. Holden drove while I sat in the back with the kids, trying to engage them in excited chatter about our upcoming adventure. But Paisley and Knox seemed subdued, almost sad. When I asked Knox what was wrong, he'd looked at his mother in the rearview mirror before mumbling, "Nothing, Grandpa." The weight of that look, the way Cordelia's jaw had tightened, should have been my final warning. At the airport check-in counter, everything had seemed normal at first. Cordelia had handled our tickets with the same efficiency she'd shown throughout the planning process. The agent had smiled and processed their boarding passes first, all showing Maui as the destination. Then she'd handed me mine, and I'd been too excited to look at it carefully. "All set," Cordelia had announced brightly. "Let's go through security." It wasn't until we reached the gate that I really looked at my boarding pass. Not Maui. Not even close. Detroit Metropolitan to downtown Detroit. A shuttle flight I didn't remember booking to a destination that made no sense. "Cordelia," I'd said, my voice already shaking, "there's been a mistake. My ticket." The look on her face when she turned around wasn't surprise. It wasn't a concern. It was resignation, as if she'd been dreading this moment, but knew it was inevitable. "Oh, Dad," she'd said, and in those 2 words, I heard the death of every hope I'd carried for the last 3 months. "Sit down, Dad," Cordelia said, her voice taking on a tone I'd never heard before, cold, clinical, like she was delivering a business presentation rather than destroying her father's world. We were in a quiet corner of the airport, away from the crowds, away from witnesses to what was about to happen. Holden stood behind her like a bodyguard, his face emotionless. Vivian held the children's hands, whispering something that made them look down at their shoes. "The truth is, we never intended for you to come to Hawaii," she continued, each word hitting me like a physical blow. "This trip, it's for our real family. You've been so lonely since Mom died, so desperate for connection, that we knew you'd pay for anything if it meant feeling included again. And we needed this vacation, Dad. Holden's been under tremendous stress at work, and the kids deserve to see the world." My legs gave out, and I sank into one of the plastic airport chairs. "But the planning, the excitement. You brought the kids over." My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone smaller and more broken than I'd ever been. Cordelia's expression softened for just a moment, not with compassion, but with something that looked almost like pity. "Those visits were necessary to maintain the illusion," she explained matter-of-factly. "We needed you invested, emotionally committed to the idea. And honestly, Dad, it wasn't entirely acting. The kids do love you in their way. But love doesn't mean we want to spend our vacation taking care of an elderly man who still thinks it's 1995. Holden nodded approvingly at his wife's words, and I saw him squeeze her shoulder in a gesture of support that made my stomach turn. "We've booked you a lovely room at the Motor City Inn," Vivian chimed in, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "It has a nice view of the freeway, and there's a Denny's right next door. Think of it as a staycation." The children still wouldn't look at me, but I could see tears in little Paisley's eyes. Knox had started biting his nails, something he only did when he was anxious. They knew this was wrong, even if they couldn't understand the full magnitude of their mother's cruelty. As I sat there, processing the enormity of what had just happened, something strange began to occur. The crushing weight of betrayal started to transform into something else, something harder and more dangerous. I watched my daughter's face as she explained how they'd researched the most cost-effective way to handle this situation, and I realized I was looking at a stranger. This wasn't the little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. This wasn't the teenager who'd cried in my arms when her first boyfriend broke her heart. "Cordelia," I said quietly, my voice steadier than it had been since this nightmare began. "Do you remember when your mother was dying?" Her confident expression flickered for the first time. "Do you remember how I worked 3 jobs to pay for her experimental treatments? How I sold everything we owned to give her 6 more months of life?" The color was slowly draining from her face, but I continued. "I remember you promising me at her funeral that we'd always have each other, that we'd honor her memory by staying close, by being the family she'd want us to be." My voice was gaining strength with each word, and I saw Holden shift uncomfortably. "Your mother would be ashamed of what you've become. She'd be horrified to know that her daughter grew up to be someone who could steal from her own father and call it a family vacation." The words hit their target. Cordelia's composure cracked, and for a moment I saw genuine pain flash across her features. But it was quickly replaced by defensive anger. "Don't you dare bring Mom into this," she snapped. "Mom's dead, Dad. She's been dead for 3 years, and you need to stop living in the past. This is about reality, about moving forward, about building new relationships and new families." That's when the last piece of my old self died. Standing up slowly, I looked at each of them in turn, my daughter, her husband, the woman who'd moved into my wife's home, and my grandchildren who couldn't meet my eyes. "You're absolutely right," I said calmly. "It is time to move forward. It is time to build new relationships. And it starts right now." The boarding call for their flight to Maui echoed through the terminal, but none of them moved. Something in my tone had changed, and they all sensed it. The Motor City Inn was exactly as advertised, a rundown roadside motel with stained carpets and the persistent smell of industrial disinfectant. As I sat on the sagging bed, staring at the receipt that showed Cordelia had paid for exactly 3 nights, I felt something crystallize inside me. They thought they'd left me broken and helpless. They thought I'd spend these days wallowing in self-pity, maybe drinking myself into oblivion, definitely not causing any trouble for their perfect Hawaiian getaway. They were wrong. I spent the first day making phone calls. Not to beg or plead or demand explanations. Those days were over. Instead, I called my bank, my lawyer, and most importantly, my old friend Marcus from the factory, who'd become a private investigator after retirement. "Teddy," he'd said when I explained the situation, "I always thought there was something off about that girl after Elena died. Give me 48 hours. While Marcus worked his contacts, I drove to Cordelia's house, my house, the one I'd bought with Elena 40 years ago, the one I'd never bothered to take off the deed after Cordelia moved back in with her new family. Vivian had been very confident about her position in our household, but she'd made one crucial error. She'd never actually checked who owned the property she was living in. The locksmith arrived at 2 p.m. sharp. "You sure about this, Mr. Brennan?" he asked as he worked on changing the locks. "These folks are going to be mighty surprised when they get back." I watched him work, thinking about Vivian's smug face at the airport, remembering how she'd moved into Elena's bedroom within weeks of meeting Cordelia, how she'd slowly taken over every space in the house that had once been mine and my wife's. By evening, the locks were changed, the utilities were scheduled to be shut off the day before their return, and I'd visited a storage company to arrange for their belongings to be collected and held, at their expense naturally. 3 days in Hawaii would cost them far more than they'd anticipated. But this was just the beginning. As I sat in my motel room that night, planning my next moves, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the pure, intoxicating power of taking control of my own life. Marcus called me on the second day with information that made my blood run cold and my resolve burn hotter than ever. "Teddy, you need to sit down for this." His gravelly voice crackled through the phone. "Your daughter's been planning this for over a year. I found records of her researching elder financial abuse laws, looking for legal ways to access your assets. She's been setting you up." The documents he'd uncovered painted a picture of calculated manipulation that went far beyond the Hawaii trip. Cordelia had been slowly positioning herself as my primary caregiver in legal documents, despite the fact that I was perfectly healthy and independent. She'd consulted with attorneys about conservatorship proceedings. Most damning of all, she'd taken out a life insurance policy on me, with herself as the sole beneficiary. "There's more," Marcus continued, his voice grim. "That husband of hers? He's not the successful investment banker they claim. His firm fired him 6 months ago for embezzling client funds. They're drowning in debt, Teddy. Your Hawaii money isn't going to luxury. It's going to keep them out of bankruptcy court." The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Vivian moving in wasn't about companionship. It was about having a witness to my supposed declining mental state. The increased visits, the sudden interest in my well-being, the careful documentation of every conversation. They'd been building a case to have me declared incompetent. The Hawaii trip was supposed to be the final step, leaving me isolated and vulnerable while they established legal control over my assets. But knowing the truth also revealed their weaknesses. They'd been so focused on manipulating me that they'd left digital trails everywhere. Bank records, email chains, legal consultations. Marcus had found it all. As I studied the evidence he'd compiled, I realized I wasn't just going to survive their betrayal. I was going to turn their own weapons against them. They'd taught me how cruel and calculating a person could be. Now they were going to learn what happened when someone with nothing left to lose decided to apply those lessons. They returned from Hawaii tanned and relaxed, their social media feeds full of pictures of crystal-clear waters and tropical sunsets, all paid for with my life savings. I watched from my rental car as their taxi pulled up to the house that was no longer their home, saw the confusion on their faces when their keys wouldn't work, and heard Cordelia's voice rising in panic as she called my phone over and over. I let them stand there for an hour before I answered. "Dad, what's going on?" Cordelia's voice was sharp with barely controlled hysteria. "We can't get into the house. The neighbors are saying someone changed the locks. This is insane. Where are you?" "I'm exactly where you left me," I replied calmly. "Alone." But I've been busy while you were enjoying your vacation." The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. "Your belongings are in storage unit 247 at You Store It on 8 Mile Road. The monthly fee is $300, due on the 1st of each month. I've paid for exactly 1 month. You can't do this." Holden's voice in the background, loud enough for me to hear. "We live there. We have rights." That's when I smiled for the first time in days. "Actually, you don't," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I've spent the last 3 days consulting with lawyers, reviewing property deeds, and examining the financial documents you thought I was too senile to understand. The house belongs to me. It always has. And as of yesterday, you're officially trespassed from the property." The sound of Cordelia crying, real tears, not the crocodile tears she'd shed at the airport, should have moved me. Once upon a time, it would have broken my heart. But that man was gone, replaced by someone harder and more pragmatic. "There's more," I continued. "I've filed fraud charges with the FBI. Embezzling from elderly family members is a federal crime, Cordelia. The penalty is up to 20 years in prison." "Dad, please," she sobbed. "Think about the children. Think about Paisley and Knox. They need stability. They need their home." For a moment, just a moment, I felt a flicker of the old Teddy Brennan. Then I remembered their faces at the airport, the way they'd looked away when their mother destroyed their grandfather's heart. "The children will be fine," I said quietly. "They'll learn an important lesson about consequences. About what happens when you take advantage of people who love you. Consider it an education in reality, something their mother clearly never received." 6 months later, I stood in the visitors area of the Wayne County Jail, looking at my daughter through reinforced glass. The FBI had been very interested in the evidence Marcus and I had compiled. Fraud, elder abuse, conspiracy. The charges had stacked up quickly. Holden was already serving time in a federal facility. Vivian had fled to her sister's house in Phoenix, abandoning the children she'd claimed to care about so deeply. Cordelia looked older, smaller, diminished by her orange jumpsuit and the institutional setting. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper through the phone, "I'm sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I need you to know I'm sorry." I studied her face, looking for the little girl I'd once loved unconditionally. She was still there, somewhere beneath the layers of greed and manipulation and desperate choices. "I know you are," I said quietly. "But sorry doesn't give me back 3 years of loneliness. Sorry doesn't undo the fact that you were willing to destroy me for a vacation." "The children," she began, and I held up my hand to stop her. "Paisley and Knox are living with Elena's sister, Catherine, in Grand Rapids," I told her. "They're in a good school, they're seeing counselors to help them process what happened, and they're learning what a real family looks like. Catherine sends me pictures sometimes. They're healing." The guard called time, but before I hung up the phone, I leaned closer to the glass. "Cordelia, I want you to know something. I forgive you. Not because you deserve it, but because carrying that anger was poisoning what's left of my life. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean pretending this didn't happen. It means I'm choosing to move forward without letting your choices define my future." As I walked out of that jail and into the Detroit sunshine, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Elena's death. Peace. Real, genuine peace. I'd lost a daughter, but I'd found myself. I'd lost my savings, but I'd gained my dignity. And for the first time in years, I was excited about the next day. My phone buzzed with a text message from Catherine. "The kids want to know if you'd like to come to Knox's baseball game this weekend. No pressure, but we'd love to see you." I smiled as I typed back, "I'll be there." Family, I'd learned, wasn't about blood obligation or shared DNA. It was about people who showed up for each other, who protected each other, who chose love over selfishness every single day. I was 58 years old, and I was finally ready to build the family I deserved, one genuine relationship at a time. The old Teddy Brennan, the pushover who'd enabled his own destruction, was gone forever. In his place stood someone stronger, wiser, and infinitely more careful about who deserved his trust. Someone who understood that the greatest revenge wasn't cruelty. It was living well, loving wisely, and never again allowing anyone to mistake kindness for weakness. As I drove toward my new apartment, toward my new life, toward the possibility of rebuilding something real with my grandchildren, I realized that Cordelia had actually given me a gift. She'd shown me what I was capable of when pushed too far. She'd taught me that I didn't have to accept betrayal as the price of love. And for that lesson, painful as it was, I was almost grateful. Spring settled over Detroit with a quiet kind of beauty. Soft rain, greening trees, the city humming awake after winter. 6 months had passed since I'd last seen Cordelia behind that glass. In that time, my world had rearranged itself in ways I never could have predicted back when I sat alone in the Motor City Inn, numb from betrayal. My new apartment overlooked a small neighborhood park where kids played baseball in the evenings. Catherine lived only a short drive away, and most weekends I found myself in her backyard, grilling burgers while Paisley and Knox chased fireflies. They no longer flinched when someone mentioned their mother. Therapy and time were doing their quiet work. When Knox hit his first over-the-fence home run, he pointed at me in the stands before rounding the bases. That one gesture felt like a lifetime of healing. I'd also gone back to the factory, not because I needed the money, but because I missed the camaraderie. 2 days a week on the floor kept me grounded. The men there called me the comeback kid, and maybe they were right. I'd learned that work could still bring pride even when the paycheck wasn't the goal. Cordelia wrote letters from jail. At first they were angry, blaming stress, Holden, even me. I didn't respond. But slowly the tone changed, regret creeping in, then humility. Her last letter arrived a week ago. Dad, I don't expect anything from you. I just want you to know I see what I did. I see how I became someone I never thought I'd be. I'm trying to change. I sat with that letter for days. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't a one-time decision. It was a practice. And while I'd already chosen to forgive her in my heart, rebuilding trust was another matter. I finally wrote back, do the work. Become someone the kids can be proud of. If you keep at it, maybe one day we'll sit across from each other without glass between us. This morning, Paisley and Knox helped me plant a small garden behind my apartment building. We tucked tomato seedlings into the soil, their laughter mixing with the sound of birds. Catherine handed me a cup of coffee and said, You know, Teddy, they talk about you like you hung the moon. I felt the warmth of her words settle deep inside. As the sun dipped low, I realized that my life, this simple, ordinary life, wasn't the consolation prize I once feared. It was the reward. I had family who showed up, friendships that held steady, and a future no one could take from me. Cordelia's choices had broken something, yes, but they'd also cleared space for something sturdier to grow. I wiped my hands on my jeans and looked around at the people who had become my real circle. This, I said quietly, almost to myself, is what love looks like. Not perfect, just true. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man who'd lost everything. I felt like a man who had finally chosen the life he wanted, rooted in honesty, built on trust, and open to whatever grace tomorrow might bring. Thank you for listening to my story. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more tales of family betrayal.